This is Mark Mullinax, and I welcome you back to our class, Power for the Peaceful, in which we explore Taoism and Tao Te Ching. This week, bonus episode number 4, an introduction to some of the historical and thematic interrelationships between and among Taoism, Tao Te Ching, and traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM.
When you listen to the ground and you put your roots down, you can hear what she says if you're listening. When you listen to the ground and you put your roots down, you can hear what she says if you're listening. The sweet sound of the river as she moves over the stones. The same song that the blood in your body sings as it weaves around your bones. When you're listening, are you listening?
My guest today, and I'm so pleased about this, is Dr. Charles Pannell. Dr. Pannell is a TCM practitioner. And faculty member at the Taoist Traditions School of Chinese Medicine in Asheville, North Carolina, where I also teach a yearly course on mindfulness with the entering class of future TCM doctors. You may find this school at www.taoisttraditions.edu, and in that URL, Taoist is spelled with a D as in David. That link and the bio for Dr. Pannell are in the show notes. Welcome, Dr. Pannell. Did I get everything right?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you having me.
Okay, thank you. So my first question is, if I have a malady and I go to two different doctors, one is a Western doctor, traditional Western doctor, and then another would be a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, what would be some of the differences in what that doctor is looking for or how they approach what that malady is?
Well, that's a great question. And so there's a huge difference. For those in the audience that have experienced going to a Chinese medicine practitioner, it's a wide spectrum of what kind of experience you might have. If there's a language barrier, right, there might not be a lot of questions. But if you go see where you share a common language, part of our training is to ask what they call the 10 questions. So we get a lot of detailed information at the outset about the patient. Even though they filled out all this paperwork and checked a bunch of boxes off or not, we still, there's a big emphasis on listening and really gathering as much information as we can about the patient's history and current condition, because oftentimes things in the history can be overlooked that affect the current condition the patient might be suffering from. So that's the biggest difference, is the amount of dialoguing that can take place in that setting. Our diagnostics are very, what some folks might call subjective. We read pulses, and by reading pulses, I mean we spend a lot of time taking pulses, and there's a whole system of understanding the pulse that goes way beyond just understanding how many beats per minute a patient has. We do some, a lot of the training is in Western medicine, but much of that is, in light of the fact that we have to dialogue with, patients that are familiar with Western medicine. We need to know what they're talking about in order to understand and be able to relate to what they have going on.
Okay. All right.
And those are just some of the minor differences, right? Our instruments are different. Our sessions tend to be longer, though not always. It varies from practitioner to practitioner. When you talk to a Chinese medicine practitioner and you're looking at what TCM means exactly, right? And yes, it's an acronym for traditional Chinese medicine. But what you'll find is among practitioners, some practitioners don't consider themselves traditional Chinese medicine practitioners. So we have a bunch of different traditions, and TCM is one of those traditions. After the revolution in China, when they began to establish the communist government, What they found was that they didn't have a whole lot of money. Western medicine at the time was very expensive. They needed to train doctors. They had an enormous population. This is coming out of World War II. So you can imagine there was some, cultural PTSD after, 30 million people killed in that conflict, which is pretty horrendous number. Many of them starved. But in order to train a large number of physicians to, take care of the country, they created TCM.
Ah, okay.
So the old model, there were the academies, which typically focused on herbal medicine in theory. Acupuncture was sort of considered as a, perhaps lesser art because it isn't as intellectually engaging as herbal medicine is. But they came up with a way to teach and train large numbers of doctors. Sort of the barefoot doctor movement that some of y'all may have heard. And so the idea with this was, for relatively low cost, they can use their cultural heritage to train a large number and send them out. And traditionally, though, it would be a 10-year apprenticeship to learn Chinese medicine. Mm-hmm. You'd work very closely with a physician or a father teacher of some kind. That's what the term shifu means. So it was a whole process that they simplified to some degree. And a lot of that simplification process under the communist government actually tried to separate out the medicine from its somewhat, it has its roots in shamanism, essentially.
Yeah, of course, yes.
And so they were trying to get away from some of the more spiritual, religious aspects of it. And so they created and formalized traditional Chinese medicine, which some people might say is watered down. I would say it's not watered down, it's more simplified, I think would be a more fair way to term that, because you can wield Chinese medicine very effectively using TCM principles. And at the school that I teach at, that's our main framework. That's what we train students in as a basis and foundation. We also broaden that foundation out and incorporate a lot of what we refer to as classical Chinese medicine. So you may find practitioners that don't resonate with the idea that they're a TCM practitioner because they think of themselves as a classical Chinese medicine practitioner. So it can be a big difference there. But I understand that using TCM as a catch-all term for Chinese medicine principles is an easy way to understand it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. What would be some of the interrelationships between Taoism as we understand it and the classical Chinese medicine that you are teaching here or practicing? What would be some of the things that you would be remembering as you treat patients that might be Taoist principles?
That's a great question. And the medicine is truly rooted in Taoist principles, but also in Taoist cosmology to a great extent. I believe Taoism is an older philosophy. I don't think Lao Tzu invented Taoism. I think maybe he just expanded on it, or codified it, maybe is a better way to put that. I think it existed long before that.
True. And
the principles and how they developed in terms of looking at nature as yin and yang. And I think it's very much a nature-based system that evolved out of trying to understand the world and what the human relationship is to that, and as part of it, not as well here's this world and I'm this thing looking down on it. It very much integrates the whole person into the process.
Okay.
A number of influences came up later, but I think that's a separate discussion when you get into the influence of Buddhism and Confucianism, because much of Chinese medicine is, at least the theory, is to some degree rooted in the culture too. To me, Chinese medicine really is a nature-based medicine, and the whole system is based. It's scientific in that it bases its understanding off of observation of nature and these interrelationships and this kind of push-pull dynamic that we see just in basic yin and yang principles, and everything seems to be an extension from that idea.
Okay. So when you ask those 10 questions of an incoming patient, would you have ideas of, are you looking for things about how things may be out of balance for that patient, yin and yang wise, or their chi or their energy? I mean, how do you start to begin to diagnose someone like that?
Well, that is the tricky part in Chinese medicine.
Yeah.
Because you can help people out pretty effectively even if the diagnosis isn't 100% correct. But the interesting thing about Chinese medicine is you can have the same patient and get a different diagnosis out of each practitioner based on what they're seeing. So in some regards, it's very subjective.
Okay.
But I think that's a strength of the medicine fundamentally, not a weakness.
Okay. All right.
Because we're not lacking in objectivity. How we interpret that,
Yeah.
right? Some things will seem more important to some physicians than others, and it all depends. It doesn't mean that the one practitioner is correct and one is incorrect.
Yeah.
That can happen,
Right.
right? If they totally miss the mark, but generally, because the practice really honors the patient,
Mm.
and the patient really retains a lot of primacy in the treatment room.
Okay. All right. So you may not be looking so much for symptoms, like if I go to my Western doctor with symptoms of a flu,
Mm-hmm.
the diagnosis can basically be done on the phone. But I don't see that happening very much in your field here.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're looking at the whole person and not just the symptoms. You're looking maybe at what may be the underlying cause or causes of those symptoms, which may be something much larger than the symptoms themselves.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
It could be, how somebody responds to a pathogen, like the flu, for instance, right? Not everybody's going to have the same kind of manifestation of those things. And rather than treating, all flu patients in the same way,
Right.
we take a pretty unique approach and treat the individual. There's an aphorism in Chinese medicine that says, treat the patient, not the disease.
Wow.
And so that's a big part of it, because really you're working with somebody's immune system in a situation like that. Either trying to enhance it or maybe even down-regulate it if their immune system is hyperactive. And the only way to figure that out is to use our diagnostic principles in Chinese medicine to see, all right, where's the person in relation to what's happening to them? Okay. And how can we enhance their ability to move through this? Because that's really how I think of my job as a Chinese medicine practitioner. Isn't so much, all right, what am I going to do to this person to get them better, to treat them? It's more rooted in the idea of, all right, how can I help them overcome what it is that they're dealing with? Okay. It's really more assistive rather than proscriptive or prescriptive.
Yeah.
So I just think that we hold the door open for the body to self-organize, self-regulate. Because I think the real strength of Chinese medicine isn't an external treatment. It's more about what can we do to enhance the patient's ability for natural self-healing to occur.
So how do you get out of the way of the body's natural healing processes?
Exactly. And so
I like that.
We try to enhance, right?
Okay.
Because the body has an incredible ability to self-heal.
Would you use the word qi? Am I saying it correctly? Qi, to understand how the body is going to try to heal itself?
Absolutely. And we measure different kinds of qi.
Could you go into that a little bit more, please?
Sure. And if your listeners are familiar with qi and what kind of the principle of that is, the general sort of translation, at least in the Chinese medicine context, is it means life energy, right? Prana would be the word in Sanskrit that might be chosen to describe something similar. Okay. But if you look at what the character implies. It's the steam rising over a hot bowl of rice.
Yeah.
So in that regard, it's fascinating. It represents the life energy, because if you think about what rice means in the Chinese culture, right? That's the staff of life. That's survival. That's the development of agriculture, so that you can take care of the community and thrive and have a culture, rather than just being a bunch of different factions of warring tribes. And they've been through that too, but really agriculture allowed for all the development of this culture, and I believe that medicine is just another facet of culture to some degree. But getting back to the concept of qi in this discussion, right? So qi can be measured in a variety of ways, and I think that's the problem that Western science and Western medicine has with Chinese medicine, is that we have this nebulous thing called qi that's sort of difficult to define and means all kinds of different things in its native original language, right? It doesn't refer to just someone's life energy. It refers to all kinds of things. It can talk about the weather. Qi can refer to, the best definition I've heard for qi, at least the one that spoke to me the most, comes from a Taoist priest, Jeffrey Ewan, who our school is sort of dedicated to expanding his teachings, and he calls it classical Chinese medicine. He's an 88th generation Taoist priest from the Jade Purity lineage. He was initiated by his adopted grandfather, and he explained qi this way, that qi is a relationship. It's not a thing so much as it is a dynamic.
Yes.
So if you think of yin and yang and how they interact and are constantly pushing and pulling each other and transforming into each other, that dynamic between yin and yang describes qi, at least in the way that makes the most sense to me. Yeah. And that's the simplest way, I think, to describe it. And so when we look at it in the context of treating patients in Chinese medicine, we have all these different sort of types of qi. And one of the questions I think that you mentioned, you brought up the three treasures, known as Jing, Qi, and Shen. And I would put forth the idea, and this is not original thinking on my part by any stretch. I'm parroting my understanding, what I've learned from Jeffrey Ewan and other Taoists I've met along the way, and my own research and studies in it as well. And in terms of the three treasures, if you think about Jing, is sort of thought of as life essence, right? And it's kind of the basis. It's the sticky substance. It's the primordial goo from which we're all created. And then we have the Shen, which is the spiritual aspect, which is the, that which kind of energizes this primordial goo. So you have yin and yang right there, right? Jing is very yin, it's dense, it's substantive, it's earthly. And then you have Shen, which is more about things that move fast. It's very what we would call yang. It's not anything you can actually trap or hold on to. It's very, I wouldn't say fluid, because it's not that dense. It's more so. It's thoughts. It's the imagination.
It's ungraspable.
Yeah, it's that spiritual dimension. It's what gives us consciousness. Yes. And so you have this idea of yin and yang embedded in those core principles, and qi, again, is that mediating factor between yin and yang, as well as Jing and Shen, which is an extension of that same concept.
I see. Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah, thank you. Wow. All right. Let's see. Well, as I walk around the campus, I see several herb gardens, and every plant is labeled in English and in Chinese. So, what's the role of herbs in the classical Chinese medicine program? Do you actually have courses in it? Do you use herbs extensively in your learning processes?
Absolutely. Herbs are a great teaching tool. Herbs are also probably one of the hardest aspects of Chinese medicine to fully master. Informationally, it's very, very dense. Much more so, I would argue, than acupuncture itself. Right? Acupuncture is a more, I don't know, you might say it has a smaller container, perhaps, than herbs. And the interesting thing about herbs is it comes from the tradition of what they refer to as the divine husbandman, who's this legendary figure known as Shen Nong, who sort of helped develop agriculture in Chinese culture, right? And so you've got this sort of giant stone statues of this human head with these big bull horns sticking out of it. That's not satanic. It's really referring more to the sort of agricultural foundations, right? Learning how to train the animals so that you can turn the soil and that you can grow the rice and change the land in order to accommodate large numbers of people being able to survive in these agricultural areas. So I think of herbal medicine as an extension of that, but I think it harkens beyond that, probably further more into the hunter-gatherer roots of the culture as well. Yeah. And as part of our education here at Taoist Traditions, it's definitely about a third of the program.
Really?
We do a third Western medicine, a third acupuncture and Chinese medicine theory, and about a third herbal medicine. And then there's, of course, learning how to practice in a clinical internship in addition to that. Okay. And so around here, we've tried to establish and figure out, which Chinese herbs grow well here, which ones don't do well here, and use those as a learning tool. So every student, when they enroll, before we start regular classes in the regular semester, we have them working and learning in the garden initially.
Okay.
To really, get close to the plants, because that is one of the most difficult parts of the education. Mm-hmm. And plants and humans, right? There's not just humans, but all life really has this interdependent relationship, which I think is, kind of a acknowledging that as an important part of understanding how we can survive and thrive in this life.
Let me dive just a little bit deeper into this one question by asking a specific. Is there a specific herb that you could isolate for our listeners, maybe an herb that everybody knows, and how it's considered or seen, and maybe how it's used in a hypothetical situation?
A lot of herbal medicine is this idea that food is medicine. And so there's a huge crossover. If you just look at basic kitchen spices, many of those are herbs in the Chinese materia medica. Yeah. Things like nutmeg, turmeric, radish seeds. It's quite extensive. Flowers you see in the garden. Chrysanthemums are a great example, right? Everybody wants to buy mums in the fall, and for their home, and those are a major TCM herb. They help to brighten the vision and clear heat, and lots of people drink it as tea. If you tend to run hot, it can be very helpful in that regard. It's relaxing to drink. Okay. So Juhua is what it's called in Chinese medicine. That's just one example. Mm-hmm. Or if you just take rice, right? It's food. But it's also considered a Chinese herb as well. And we use sprouted rice, particularly in terms of being able to treat poor digestion, for example. Okay. And in the West, we eat a lot of what we call, kind of sticky, cloying foods, right? We love, pizza and hamburgers and things of that nature that tend to be on the heavier end of the spectrum. And so there's a lot we can do with Chinese medicine, food therapy, for example, which is adjacent, you might say, to herbal medicine, but is its own distinct practice. So Chinese medicine is very broad. It has 9 different approaches you can take. You have like massage, you have acupuncture, you've got moxibustion, you have herbal medicine. There's qigong practices. There's food therapy, and I think I named maybe 6 out of 9.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different approaches you can take. But the cool thing about Chinese medicine to me is that the theory and the application is consistent regardless of which approach you're taking to address what it is that you're working with. And one thing I would add as a caveat, if you look at what we call the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which is where most of our theory is based out of and developed from this idea, and it really fleshes out, yin and yang and the 5 elements in the context of how to apply this medicine on a human body. Well, 5 elements developed a little bit more later. In the early bits, it's a little less formalized. But in terms of looking at pathology, the first chapter of the Su Wen, which is the dialogue between the Yellow Emperor and his chief physician, it talks about, in the days of yore, the sages were able to preserve life by not getting sick in the first place. It says something to that effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I think at its core, Chinese medicine is fundamentally a preventive medicine and is most effective when practiced preventively. So I encourage all of your listeners to seek out Chinese medicine, even if they're in full health, because really you'll get better results in the long run and be able to live a more full life if you're able to address things from a more preventive standpoint. And I think that's also another huge benefit of Chinese medicine. Yes, we have all these
cures.
Yeah, cures. Yeah. And we have that in Western medicine. We have that in Chinese medicine. Now, the Chinese have been observing and logging this stuff and writing it down for, I wouldn't say centuries, millennia might be a better way, and copying it and learning and building on this knowledge base. So it's profound, and it's really an endless study from an academic standpoint. And really, its roots, I think, make it strong, and that's perhaps why it's been able to last as long as it has. And I'm thankful to the communists who created TCM, because I think to some degree that really saved Chinese medicine from obscurity and dying out as a practice. And
when you're listening, are you listening? When you're listening, are you listening?
This next question is about acupuncture, which you say is about 1/3 of the course requirements here at Taoist Tradition School of Chinese Medicine. My first exposure to acupuncture, I actually was in China for 10 days in 1981 when people from outside were first able to go in, and they wanted to expose us foreigners to some of the Chinese medicines. They actually showed us a working operating theater, and someone was undergoing an appendectomy, and the only anesthesia was needles, acupuncture. And my jaw just dropped to the floor. I said, how does this work? So educate us about how acupuncture is so important, and what are some of the Taoist or some of the principles going on behind the scenes of this acupuncture, please?
Well, I've never gotten to witness that personally. You're the second person I've talked to that's actually gotten to witness that with Chinese medicine practitioners using acupuncture. Essentially, I would argue that it's similar to doing nerve blocks in Western medicine, or an epidural, in order to create the anesthetic effect. So the fact that we can do that with just needles is pretty amazing. One thing that I recall he mentioned was that for conditions and surgeries above the diaphragm, it's not as an effective way to actually manage the pain. Though there are some old practitioners of Chinese medicine that were capable of doing things like removing cataracts, just using, I assume, a scalpel and some acupuncture needles to manage that. So I don't think it's 100% that you can't treat things above the diaphragm. So one of the big things that the Chinese medicine and acupuncture specifically is known for is being able to manage pain. And what it has a regulating effect on the nervous system, and if planned strategically, right, you can use it to actually block some of those sensory experiences, so that you could have open abdominal surgery. And you're not talking about with doing orthoscopic surgery where they just do a few minor insertions. Having the appendix removed is major surgery. That's opening up the abdomen and exposing the viscera. It's pretty incredible. And and right, how do we explain that in scientific and Western medicine terms? It's difficult to explain because it seems miraculous, but there has to be a physical basis for it. And as a Chinese medicine practitioner, what I would argue is that you have to factor in the qi concept, because all of our medicine and the commodity that we're able to manipulate so effectively in Chinese medicine is this idea of qi, which is something that's very, very difficult to measure. So in terms of satisfying the more Western-minded or Newtonian mindset, you might say, would be, this is like doing a nerve block. And we actually, do treat very close to the nerve roots. And something about stimulating the qi in these areas or opening up blockages or creating temporary blockages is a way to actually downregulate pain. Now, they've done tons of studies to try to understand this in terms of Western medicine and Western science, to be able to explain why this would work. So there, many Westerners would say, "Oh, well, it's not proven and there's no basis for it." But actually, there's been tons of research, and it's all well documented. Granted, 90% of it is probably still in Chinese, but it's out there, and they've done plenty of placebo-controlled, double-blind research studies to figure this out and explain it to the satisfaction of Western science. And in China, often they're both trained in Western medicine and Chinese medicine. And you'll find in Europe it's the same thing. To practice in Italy or France, for example, you have to be trained in Western medicine to be able to practice Chinese medicine. So
I see.
They're not mutually exclusive. If anything, I would think that would be a huge asset. To have something a little outside of the box of, pills and surgeries to treat things.
I think hospitals now use the term holistic medicine or integrative medicine as a way of saying we're open to other ideas.
Yeah.
Let me just follow up on acupuncture. You mentioned several times that it's a way to block pain. Is it also a good strategy, acupuncture, to unblock pain or unblock other things?
Absolutely.
Can you use it to unblock?
Yeah. Often the way that we understand pain, pain can come from a number of things. Pain can come from blockage, right? That's the most common form of pain, right? You sit too long and you're stiff and achy when you get up, right? That's pain. But once you move around, you regulate the qi, we would call that, and the pain goes away. And acupuncture can function in a very similar way, essentially. And often if you have pain, for example, that doesn't respond to getting up and walking around, right? We try and figure out what's at the root of that pain or the root cause. Is it something old? Is it something new? what does it feel like, right? We have all these, what we would call a pathogenic factor, right? Because some pain might be due to things of a more hot nature, and so we want to cool that down. Or if it's due to the fact that there's too much cold internally, right? We do things to try to warm that up so that we can unblock it and move it. Dull and achy things tend to be what we call a damp nature. So again, if you think about things like hot, cold, and damp, those are all essentially based on observation of nature.
Yes.
And how that affects the human body, right? You sleep next to an open window or under a fan, you wake up with a stiff neck in the morning. We call that cold penetration. And basically the idea is that, if you look at it from a Western medicine standpoint, yes, the temperature affected the circulation in the tissues in that area. And so, we would unblock that because that's a simple, what we would call an excess condition. You can also have pain due to there not being enough resources available internally. And we have ways of working with that, especially with moxibustion and herbal medicine.
What is moxibustion?
Moxibustion, that is an extension of herbal medicine, but applied like acupuncture. It's a fascinating phenomenon. So it's a herb called mugwort, which is Artemisia annua, and it's harvested about the time it's about to come to flower, when you can start to smell it. And then it's ground up and sifted and then aged for years. And so they do it in different grades. You've got your pure gold moxa, which is the good stuff that's been aged for 10 plus years and has a lot of the stems and the woody bits filtered out. And then you've got, lesser and lesser grades of moxa under that. And basically moxibustion, it turns into this kind of fleecy stuff that has a cottony quality, so it sticks to itself. And we use it as a heat therapy. We actually burn it over acupoints. We burn it over areas where there might be stagnation or deficiency in order to promote healing. It's miraculously effective. And if you look at the just basic theory in terms of yin and yang, boiling it down to its Taoist roots, right? You're taking heat, you're taking yang to invigorate the qi, or to get the qi moving if it's stuck, whether it's due to excess or deficiency, and you apply it in different ways. Now, in Asia, they literally will apply moxa directly to the skin and cause a blister at an acupoint, which is not something we do in the West as much. Most people aren't comfortable with being burned here. So we use what they call a moxapole or other devices that actually keep it away from the skin, so that we can heat an area up without burning the patient, and they still get the benefit of that same activation of those acupoints. Yeah, so moxibustion is wonderful. I use it a lot. I think it's an underused aspect of Chinese medicine, and it creates smoke, and it's a little stinky. You might want some ventilation or a window open if you're going to use it. But it's something that a lot of people will practice on themselves, because you can do it at home, and it's really common to use moxibustion in China.
Okay. I think I have one more question, but then I'd like to open up to you as to what have we missed. If there's something you'd like to really focus on, I'd love to hear from you about that.
Yeah.
But my last question is, the teachings of Taoism and Tao Te Ching use the phrase Wu-Wei, which literally means no action, but I don't like that. I like more effortless action that is wise at the moment. Right time, right place, right action, kind of thing. So how does this concept of Wu-Wei apply to the practices in TCM, particularly in the context of patient care or treatment?
Yeah, that's a great question about Wu-Wei specifically. I agree. I think the translation of that term leaves much to be desired, because this idea that you can do everything by doing nothing which is one of the ways I've seen it put, which
Yes. Yeah.
I think kind of explains it well, but I think you brought up a really important element, this idea of timing.
Yes.
And particularly, you being a mindfulness expert and embracing the Tao, and really the only time with which we have to act is the present moment, right? There truly is no other time. Time is an abstract, in my view. And, right, you can have all these ideas about what's supposed to happen in the future, but the future rarely pans out exactly how you plan it.
Right.
And, being hung up in the past, as we know, hindsight's 50-50. It's definitely not 20-20. People remember what they want to remember. Yeah. And that's been proven time and time again.
Yes.
That, that even with video stuff, right? You've got this video of an event, and everybody that was present at the event remembers it in a completely different way. And so no two versions of the story are the same. But in terms of looking at it in the clinical context, yes, in this idea of Wu-Wei, I would argue it harkens back to this idea of Chinese medicine being fundamentally a preventive medicine. Yeah. And that, by accepting things as they are and allowing things to run their natural course, right, healing can be achieved this way. What often happens is we get uncomfortable with that process and we get in the way. We interfere with the natural unfoldment of, for lack of a better term, what our destiny is. And, sure, your destiny is what you make it. And your destiny isn't necessarily some preset thing because as previously said, right, the only time is the present moment. There's no other time. The rest is abstracted. Yes. It's an idea. It's not a reality. Yeah. And in terms of bringing that to a patient in the present moment, that's literally what we try and do as practitioners. That's a big part of what we call at Taoist traditions the cultivation of the practitioner. Having a healing presence. Uh-huh. And simply by sitting in the room with somebody, yeah, and listening to what they're saying, yeah, or just observing them and being present with that and not thinking about where you're going to go or what's going to happen next in the treatment, and just allowing that moment to unfold as it is, and really, yeah, being present with it. Not judging it, mm-hmm, not trying to extrapolate it or pull it into its separate parts. I mean, that is part of the process of diagnosis. Mm-hmm. Sitting there and acknowledging that a person is suffering in the moment. Yeah. That's truly where I think the actual healing takes place. Oftentimes, if a patient is moved to tears, yeah, I'm inclined to go ahead and send them home without doing any diagnosis or treatment because, yeah, they've already accomplished what they came for. They moved through, oh, the difficult thing. Now, it may not be fully resolved. Yeah, of course not. But yeah, and of course I don't really send them home because there's an expectation that, something is to be done. So, we go through the ritual of, mm-hmm, coming up with a diagnosis and a treatment plan and applying that treatment, yeah, whether it's Qigong or acupuncture and herbal medicine. Okay. So it's a very individual medicine, and no two practitioners, yeah, do it the same way.
Yeah. Wu-Wei is very difficult for most of us to grab hold of because we've been brought up in a culture that's action-oriented, do something, don't do nothing, just do something. And so I really appreciate what you said about the wisdom of withholding treatment and let the qi or the forces or the energies within the patient or within the room at the time play themselves out. And then you ride that wave rather than try to create new waves. So
exactly. And yeah, definitely waves is an excellent way to put it because, yeah, every interaction that we have creates a ripple,
yes,
in the environment, with other people and with the space that we're in.
Well, let me turn the table and see if you have any final thoughts or things that you think we would like to hear that I've not asked.
Well, I think you really covered the gamut really well there, Mark, and asked some very insightful and informative questions. Thank you for bringing this idea. Now, I know we haven't really gotten to talk about Taoism specifically. We've focused more on the medicine itself, but given the history and the influence of Taoism, many of the great practitioners of Chinese medicine historically that we know of, names like Ge Hong or Sun Sun Miao, those are just, a couple major examples of, the Taoists in the past that have it really truly informed the medicine, even to this day, though Ge Hong was 2,000 years ago, approximately. And his influence on the medicine still lingers. And, bringing some of these, what we consider to be classical concepts of Chinese medicine out, really, I think, adds a lot to the TCM framework, which, kind of serves as a great basis to be able to understand pathology and to be able to come up with effective methods for treating it. But if you broaden that idea out, right, there's a really incredibly strong spiritual dimension to the practice of Chinese medicine, and it's strongly rooted in Taoism and Buddhism to some degree, but it isn't like applied Buddhism. I would say one of the things that Jeffrey Ewan is often repeats is that the practice of Chinese medicine is essentially applied Chinese philosophy. And having embarked on this path and been practicing for the last 15 years maybe, it's really true. You are literally applying a concept, and sure, we have these tangible methods and these things that seem like, oh, well, this is a treatment, and you read articles about it in the news, and but fundamentally it's very individualized. No two patients are treated the same. You could have a patient with totally different presentations that receive the same treatment and respond in very different ways. So nothing is ever cut and dried in Chinese medicine, is what I've come to discover. Okay. And that's one of the beautiful things in terms of this Taoist idea of allowing things to unfold naturally without trying to interfere with them. You're trying to work with it, but you're not necessarily trying to manipulate and control it. Now, sometimes you're maybe influencing what happens to some degree, but you have the patient's tacit permission. They've come to you seeking help, and ostensibly we want to try to express that compassion, and but in a spontaneous way. Because really, if you think about bringing it back to the roots of Taoism, it's all about, right, from nothing, something happens. And it's spontaneous, right? It happens of its own accord. And that's where the real magic in the medicine is to me.
As my listeners would know, I love the Chinese phrase jiran, which is spontaneity. It happened self-so. It happened all by itself. Well, I do have one additional question. If someone wanted to commit to a course in Chinese medicine and they wanted to come here, what might their first year of courses look like? I mean, just a brief rundown of what their coursework would be.
Oh, that's a great question, Mark. And so, as I mentioned before, we start off in the garden. We also start off learning Qigong in that brief summer session that we do before the regular semester starts. Qigong is essentially considered to be kind of exercises that help regulate or augment qi in the body. This idea that you can self-treat, right? Using movement, using intention, and using the breath. Those three things, right? That again, it kind of comes back to this idea of the three treasures, right? What you do with your body, what you do with your mind and your consciousness, and how you integrate those two things together. Fundamentally, that's all Qigong is. So you could do it in a variety of ways. You can create your own Qigongs. So but it helps to understand what it is you're attempting to do. But as far as our program is concerned, you start off in herbal medicine pretty intensely. You learn foundational theory, also basic anatomy and physiology. And anatomy and physiology is geared towards the practice of acupuncture as well. So I personally teach classes in Qigong and surface anatomy, techniques like moxibustion, cupping therapy, gua sha, which is a scraping technique. So they get all of that in the first year, and you'll learn tools at the get-go of things that you can actually use to start practicing on yourself that don't involve puncturing the skin with a needle. Not yet. That doesn't happen until the second year of study. So we start them off pretty slowly, but it's intense. It's a lot of information. Herbal medicine is very theory and information dense. So it's a challenging program. I'll say that it's not the kind of thing where you just pay your money and get a degree and go practice Chinese medicine. It takes some time and some energy and a lot of patience to learn.
Yeah. The students I've seen here feel it is almost like a calling. They've come from all over the United States or other countries, and they've uprooted their lives to do this.
It's true.
Yeah.
And I did that myself once upon a time, and
Okay.
I don't regret it. I never anticipated ending up here as a professor of Chinese medicine. Right, that was never in my wasn't in my radar till I started studying Chinese medicine, and it was a calling. I didn't plan this out. My interest comes from the Qigong perspective, and I really wanted to understand Qi, and I felt like martial arts wasn't really satisfying that, and I wanted something a little more, crunchy and dense, because I felt like Chinese medicine really had a very firm grasp on understanding that and experiencing that. And of course what I've learned is that, from a Qi concept, information is not knowledge. But applying information, that's where wisdom and knowledge start to become useful.
Well, thank you very much. I've really learned a lot from you today, and I appreciate your willingness to share with us. Any last words?
Thank you for having me, Mark. This has been a great experience, and I appreciate your insightful questioning. And I'll say this for your listeners out there: I really enjoy his translation of the Tao Te Ching. It's not necessarily based on other translations, and Mark, you go to great lengths to make it relatable by including quotes from other sources from all kinds of different backgrounds. And really, that's a marvelous way to present the material to make it relatable to a 21st century modern audience. And I appreciate that. Yeah. So thank you for your excellent work.
Thank you. That was my chief intention, is to make Tao more heard today. Thanks again, and blessings on your day.
Cheers. Thank you.
This podcast is an original labor of love, designed, written, and co-produced by many, whose central idea is that Tao Te Ching text and Taoist practices are good news for today. Tao still speaks. Thank you, Charles Pannell, for your voice, your wisdom, and your teaching. Thank you, Audrey Davis, for your art. Thank you, Molly Hartwell, for singing. Fortress Press holds the copyright for any use of my Tao Te Ching translation. Thank you for being here. May your days begin in peace and become classrooms for learning how to heal.